Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
33 minutes after 8. Very glad to have with us this morning. 65 degrees outside. Very glad to have with us this morning Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Guessing you want to get right into the appearance of President Trump yesterday, Utica, Watertown areas.
Well, I certainly think it's worth a mention here. President Trump was here, among other things, announcing the signing of the Defense Authorization Bill, a very, very important bill that has expanded defense spending in the U.S. It's a bill that is named after Senator John McCain, and I think all the more appropriately this year in light of Senator McCain's illness. Not once did the president mention the name of John McCain. And not only did he not mention McCain's name, but he made sure that no one else on the podium, none of the other people there, would mention John McCain's name, including, of course, the people who had served with McCain in Congress. And I'm just stunned with how unpresidential that is, how petty that is, and that we have to put up with this for another 3 years or 2 years or 8 years or whatever the heck it's going to be. We've never had a president like this, and I think that one has to give a lot of credit to McCain. Now, I will say that Senator McCain's relationship with Trump was not a good one before the election. As a matter of fact, historically, we can go all the way back to 1999 to find President, well, he wasn't President Trump at that time, but Donald Trump.
The tension goes all the way back then.
Sure, hostile to McCain. So, this is kind of a long-running feud. But the feud was started by Trump, not by McCain, and I think that one has to credit the fact that McCain really was a war hero. Here's a guy who, when he was imprisoned by the North Vietnamese back during the 1960s and the 1970s, refused to leave. His captors would have allowed him to leave because of the prominence of Senator McCain's father, who was an admiral, one of the naval leaders in the United States. McCain refused to leave because his other fellow prisoners were certainly not being allowed to leave. He was tortured by the North Vietnamese. It's a very, very sad story on one level, and yet I think it's a very encouraging story on another, that there are people.
That was the place was called the Hanoi Hilton. That was the nickname?
Yeah, that was the nickname of the prison.
Well, do you remember the real name?
No, I really don't.
Okay,
I really don't. But I do remember that there was an attempt on the part of the U.S. military, a joint attempt of Army, Navy, and Air Force all together to free prisoners there. Unfortunately, the prisoners had been moved by that time. But in either case, the point here is that McCain is a genuine hero, and we should honor him. And that the president is so petty as to, omit entirely, and to have his associates omit entirely McCain's name, I think is just a sad commentary, a sad way to start today's program on this very, very rainy day.
Most of the speech was about economic achievements at the national level. Then the president talked about how he was disappointed in Governor Andrew Cuomo for banning hydrofracking in New York State. Said it would be a big thing for the Utica area. That's where he talked about that when he was speaking on behalf of Congresswoman Claudia Tenney at a fundraiser there. Took some shots at Cuomo, and made some criticisms of Governor Cuomo, and also briefly of Senator Gillibrand.
Well, look, I mean, Cuomo's a politician. Gillibrand's a politician. They should be used to criticism by this time. I hope they have thick skins. Trump claims that he's not a politician, but of course he is a politician, and one expects that President Trump is going to do what President Trump does. So, of course, he attacked them. But I think that there's for me at least, a somewhat larger issue here, and it has to do not so much with the specific attack on a particular politician or a defense by that politician against the person who's doing the attacking. It has to do with the issue of fracking. Have jobs been created in areas that have been characterized by fracking? I think the answer is unquestionably yes. Plenty of jobs. By the same token, there are other other values that we have, not the least of which is the condition of our land. In some areas where there has been fracking, not in New York State because there really hasn't been much fracking here, but in some areas drinking water has been contaminated by methane. And occasionally, and this has been disputed, but I don't think that there's much dispute any longer, drinking water has come out of the taps of water faucets in flames. In Oklahoma, where there's been a great deal of fracking, there have been areas of the state that have been characterized by many hundreds and hundreds of very small earthquakes. We don't know what the final effect of this fracking is going to be, but there is something to be said for environmental protection, and that's a long-term issue rather than a short-term issue. And if we give up on that, if we say, all right, we're going to get rid of all of our regulations because to one extent or another they may limit some economic development, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. I think we're doing ourselves long-term harm. To back away from the Clean Water Act of the early 1970s and the Clean Air of the 1970s, which the president has done just recently within the context of this very, very week. He has relaxed rules regarding the pouring of industrial waste into streams. Well, eventually that's going to contaminate not only the stream but the land downstream. And consequently, what I'm arguing, we got to take a broader view of this, and I think that one has to think about this also in terms of a larger issue. I think that is really, really global, which is global warming, climate change, and I wouldn't mind getting into that if you're interested in talking about that, Brian.
Go ahead.
Well, our climate is warming. We did not have any really reliable temperature measurements before about 1875. So, we've had these things for about 150 years, but the Earth has been around for about 4 billion years. And so I think, it's always a little bit hazardous to talk about very, very long-term developments. But climate scientists know that the issue of warming and temperature variations can be traced back with some accuracy thousands upon thousands of years. And what they know also is that we have had a significant warming, especially in the period since about 1950 or 1960. And why is that? Well, there may be natural reasons, but there may also be, there almost certainly are. There's a scientific consensus on this. Man-made reasons, human intervention in the economy, into the climate. And of course, I think that most of our listeners know that involves increased levels of CO2, in other words, increased levels of carbon dioxide. Now, what carbon dioxide does is to hold the warmth of the sun closer to the Earth than would otherwise be the case. And so globally, we've had a good deal of global warming. The levels of carbon dioxide, even found in areas like the Arctic, are almost, not quite, but almost double what they were back in 1960. That's a very, very significant development. And we also know that 17 of the 18 warmest years in recorded weather history have occurred this century. Okay, this year is on record right now, likely to be the 4th warmest year in global history. Last year, if I'm not mistaken, was the 3rd warmest. So you do have variations. In 2014, in February of 2014, we had a very, very cold weather in this part of the country. Niagara Falls froze in February of 1914. That's very, very unusual. It was the first time, I think, in about 75 years that had happened. But by the same token, when you look at the global pattern, what we find is a very, very disturbing trend in respect to warming, and we have a lot to do with that.
The conservatives tend to argue against the environmentalist movement as a general rule. They'll often discredit them. The phrase environmentalist wackos is used against them. frequently by the conservatives, who maintain that if it involves economic development, environmentalists will find a way against it one way or the other. What would you say to that?
Well, I think the real wackos are people who deny that there is global warming and that there is no human contribution to global warming. Ask the people in California if they believe in, environmental wackos at this point. We have right now, as we speak, the biggest fire in California history. And it's not just there's one fire. There are scores and scores of fires, not only in California, but in the state of Oregon, some of it into Nevada and whatnot. We have seen hurricanes unlike any that we have seen before in terms of the amount of moisture that they have provided. We all know what happened in Houston about a year or so ago. This is becoming a pattern. We're calling it the new normal, except that. And this is an important point to make. It's not a new normal that we're having these hurricanes and that we're having these fires and that we're having these elevated temperatures. We are still on a upward. We're still on an upward trend. It hasn't plateaued yet. So I'm afraid of where the so-called new normal is going to be. My brother lives in San Antonio, and he called me the other day. And, the temperature here was, I don't remember exactly, but about 80 degrees, I guess, maybe low 80s. And he said it's 102 degrees, and it was already early evening. Now, if you want to live in those kinds of conditions, fine. But to live in those conditions, you need air conditioning. Air conditioning needs power, and that power is going to throw even more fossil fuel waste into the atmosphere. In other words, even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so we're on a trend, in other words, that we can't get off. The hotter it gets, the more air conditioning we need. The more air conditioning we need, of course, the worse things are going to get. That is to say, in terms of energy use. And I want to say one other thing. Back in the 1970s, we had a chance to stop all this. There were climate scientists, environmentalists, most importantly, a fellow by the name of Rafe Pomerantz, who worked for a environmental group called Friends of the Earth. And he predicted exactly, based on some very, very shrewd calculations, what was going to happen. And what has happened is exactly what he predicted. But by the 1980s, there were other climate scientists who were joining with him. So today, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but probably in the neighborhood of 97 to 98% of all climate scientists accept the reality not only of global warming, but accept the importance of the human contribution to all of this. And when we talk about conservatives and environmental wackos, we ought to remember that back in the 1970s, when Rafe Pomerantz was first issuing these warnings, there were corporations like ExxonMobil, like Shell, some of the largest energy companies in the world, that were joining, that took this very, very seriously. It was only into the late 80s and into the 90s and then, our own century, that the large companies, for economic reasons, having to do with their own profit line, having to do with their own share price, that they turned against the environmental movement. And I think, again, it's a short-term gain economically for a long-term price that we're going to pay.
Pretty much the leader, I think I could say, of the environmental movement, maybe not the official leader, but the one that people recognize the most is Robert Kennedy Jr., son of U.S. Senator and U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy Sr. Robert Kennedy Jr., we have a show on Saturday nights, as you know, Ring of Fire, and he's Robert Kennedy Jr. is sometimes one of the co-hosts on that show. And he's frequently criticized, Kennedy is, for speaking out against big corporations. And he actually complimented Tucker Carlson on Fox. Kennedy said, I'm very glad you had the courage to have me on, because I speak against these big corporations, very often pharmaceutical companies, and thank you for having the courage to have me on, because a lot of the big sponsors prevent any kind of real dialogue in the media because of the amount of money that they pay, the big what a lot of the liberals like Robert Kennedy would refer to as the corporate media. Well, and they don't allow any kind of discussion on any medicines that could cause problems, agricultural products that Kennedy argues causes cancer, etc.
I think that Kennedy's observation is a very, very important one. Westinghouse eventually bought, I think if I'm right in saying that, Westinghouse bought ABC some years ago. Now, I don't even know whether Westinghouse owns it today. I think ABC today is Disney. But when Westinghouse bought ABC, could you imagine on the ABC News, the evening news, that they would criticize Westinghouse for, let's say, some environmental issues having to do with pollution, having to do with, who knows what at that point? Corporations are going to protect themselves. They're concerned about their share price. They're not very reflective when it comes to the public interest. Or to put it differently, as a very, very famous Secretary of Defense said, who previously had been the chairman, the president, actually they called it at that time, of General Electric. He said, "What's good for General Electric is good for the United States." Well, that's not necessarily true. Maybe at some points it's true in respect to things like employment, and at other times when it comes to things like the environment, it's not true. We all know what happened at Love Canal. There are many, what we now call these Superfund sites, and for the most part, the corporations were responsible for this, and then many of them, not all of them, but many of them walked away from their responsibility in terms of cleanup and so forth. So yeah, I think that one has to understand that there's a conflict here. And Brian, I want to note one other thing in respect to this, and that is that way back during the 1880s, the Supreme Court of the United States defined corporations as people, as individuals, and gave them the rights of individuals in respect to free speech, in respect to free press, and so forth. In other words, the ability to limit some of what corporations may say is circumscribed by the fact that they are viewed as individuals under the First Amendment of the Constitution. Well, they're not individuals. They're not people. They don't marry. They don't die. Well, maybe they eventually go bankrupt. But they don't do a lot of the things that individuals do. And yet, I think that, we know certainly, let's say, the tobacco companies way back during the 1980s and the 1990s who were still arguing that that nicotine was not addictive, and saying this before Congress, a whole chorus of tobacco executives saying this. That's not serving the public interest, nor is the price of pharmaceutical drugs, of prescription drugs that we have to pay in this country. When in Canada you can buy a prescription drug for, let's say, $5 or $6 a pill, but in the United States it costs $50 or $60 a pill. And in some cases, let's say in respect to chemotherapy, not $60, but perhaps $700 or $800 a pill. We are not served. If you don't have insurance, you're out of luck. And if you do have insurance, you may not have it pretty soon, particularly since insurance companies may go back to not covering pre-existing conditions.
We're going to take a quick break. We're late on the break. We're with Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University history professor this morning. Stay with us.
What should you do if you're sick, but your doctor's office is closed, or you don't have a primary care provider? Choose St. James Hospital's Express Care. Express Care is located at 20 Elm Street in Hornell. We have new hours to better serve the community. We're open Monday through Friday from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Saturday and Sunday from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. And you never need an appointment. Express Care from UR Medicine, St. James Mercy Hospital. Quality care on a schedule that works for you.
And meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Yes, it's raining around here, as Rob knows, but where is it raining the heaviest this morning, Rob? Rush.
Yeah, Rush. That's one of the places it's raining very heavily this morning. In fact, the National Weather Service, Brian, has put out a couple of flash flood warnings in that part of the state. Right now I'm looking at flood warning in effect for parts of southern Tioga, Susquehanna, and northern Bradford counties in Pennsylvania because of heavy rainfall. They're very concerned about the flash flooding in that part of the world. Chemung, Barton, Rush, Athens, Clifford, all those towns to our south and east are concerned about flash flooding. It's the reason we've got this stalled upper-level storm system, which is locked in across the region and will continue to produce scattered showers and thunderstorms as it slowly lifts off towards the north and east. That'll lead to improving weather. We'll see the showers and thunderstorms diminish by late today. We're 75 to 80. Sunrise this morning was at 6:17. It's at 8:12 tonight. Clearing skies tonight, but with all the recent rain, Brian, I think we'll see areas of patchy fog develop overnight. Lows will be near 65. Tomorrow, sun and clouds, chance for a shower or a thunderstorm, 85 to 90. Partly to mostly cloudy tomorrow night, 65 to 70. And then Brian, Thursday, new system heads our way. More showers and thunderstorms, 80 to 85.
Hey, thanks, Rob.
This
You
is
got
where
it,
you
sir.
hear Rush Limbaugh.
Back with Alfred University. The two big rushes there, Rush Limbaugh and Rush the Band. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower, Alfred University history professor. Dr. Ostrower, in the last segment we talked about the environmentalist movement. Did you have any thoughts on pulling out of the Paris Accord?
Yeah, I think it was one of the more foolish things that the United States has done internationally at least, over the last 40 or 50 years. Okay, maybe it doesn't quite compare to our getting involved in the war in Iraq in 2003, but it's way up there. The Paris Accord, look, the Paris Accords was a fairly complicated agreement, but what it essentially did was to argue that was to have the countries that signed the accord, which by the way involves virtually every other country on the face of the earth, with a single exception, I think, of Honduras. And I think that even Honduras may now be a signatory to the Paris Accord. But in either case, the countries that signed the Paris Accord had pledged to try to limit CO2 growth to 2% a year, And the United States pulled out of that. And we pulled out of it as a result of the pressure of some of the very large corporations that we were talking about before, and also the willingness of the Trump administration to essentially go it alone, to essentially isolate ourselves, from the rest of the international community. And so now we are out of the Paris Accords. The Accords still remain in effect. Other countries are trying as best they can to respect that. But I think, again, it says something about, if you will, the disdain, maybe even the contempt that the current administration of Washington has for international agreements. And, once upon a time, let's say back in the 18th century, and I say this as a historian, maybe we could have gone on our own. But today we can't. Today we're all going to. Today we're all going to be affected by what happens. If the Canadians pollute our waters, if we pollute their waters, if the Chinese affect our air, hey, we all pay a price for that.
Dr. Ostrower, we are out of time. Always good having you on.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, Brian.
It's AM 1480 WLEA Hornell, and we talked about Rush a couple of minutes ago. Here he is now.